Now, the first issue that we're going to deal with is evidence for the Bible. And very simply, for those of you who are watching online, you will have beautiful pictures. For the rest of us here, God has given us a beautiful sunshine day, which works to my disadvantage. I did ask perhaps we could move the building round a little, or the sun, but neither seemed to be quite possible. So I'm sorry, the screen is really a little bit too bright. But what I'm aiming to do is to illustrate that wherever it can be checked, the Bible consistently records true history. That is my objective. We are not demonstrating that the Bible is God's word. That hangs on a different cluster of proofs and beliefs and faith. But it is true history. And the whole unfolding message of salvation is rooted in reality. And the first session, I'm going to do it through the medium of archaeology. Archaeology, very simply, is rubbish. It is the leftovers of previous civilizations. As cities were destroyed and rebuilt, then the whole city grew higher and higher. And these big mounds you see is called a tell, and that means a ruin mound. You have exactly the same thing actually here in the housesteads and so on, because the Roman pavements are sometimes 15 or more feet below where you're walking. That sort of thing happens. Put that over many centuries and you've got quite a big hill. You'll see that as we go. How the people lived, how they fought, what they ate, how they died, how they buried, what they worshipped. It's all there waiting for us to uncover. Professor Donald Wiseman, a very fine evangelical professor of archaeology, said to me on one occasion, archaeology, correctly understood, always confirms the accuracy of the Bible. So we're going to look at a few people and events that some thought never existed. Because whenever people say, well, the Bible is not true, it's normally because they haven't either read it or they certainly haven't studied the subject. Because there are many things that are revealed in the Bible that at one time were thought were nonsense and now are universally accepted. How far back can we go? People always say, do we have any archaeology of Adam and Eve? Well, the answer, frankly, is we're not even sure where Eden was, so we're not going to start at that point. But we can start here, a global flood. Of course, the prophet Isaiah referred to it, Jesus referred to it, the apostle referred to it, and they all believed in a global flood that was a fact of history. But interestingly, every continent of the world, with the single exception of Antarctica, and you may work out why, every continent of the world has evidences, traditions, some of them quite wacky and quite quaint, but traditions of a global flood. That doesn't prove anything, but it indicates that there is in the traditions and the legends of the world, right across history, that there was at one time a global flood. The two best known ones is the Atrahasis record and the Gilgamesh epic. We will focus particularly on the latter, the Gilgamesh epic. Now, what you're looking at there is considered by the British Museum to be one of its best tablets, clay tablets. It is the story of a flood. The one you're looking at is only about 600 BC, although they believe it is predates that by some, perhaps into the 17th century BC, give or take before or after Moses. And it has very real similarities. The story very simply goes like this. Gilgamesh is looking to get immortality, meets up with Utnapishtim, who says, well, I and my family got it, and this is how, because Ea, the god, the chief god, told us there was going to be a great flood, and I had to build a boat. So he built this great big six-decker. In his case, it would be a cube, so it would have just toppled over if it had been in a flood. He built this big boat. He and some of the carpenters and his family got on board. They rode out a flood that lasted only 1 week. but it was so terrifying that even the lesser gods were scared of it. And then he sent out a dove and a raven and a swallow. In his case, it was the raven that came back, and they hit dry land, came out, worshipped the gods who clustered around, smelling the nice aroma that he was offering them. Now that, in a very short nutshell, is the story of Gilgamesh, and immediately you can see the connections. And you have to ask the question, well, where did that connection come from? Now, of course, the Bible critics will say, well, of course, the biblical story got it from the Gilgamesh epic. There is absolutely no evidence, of course, for that. It's a whole question as to which is the first record that we have. But the only sane record is that we have in the New Testament, in the Old Testament. I'm not going to say more about that. You can come back if you want to ask any questions. But let's answer the question, what about Abraham? Did Abraham exist? Well, we don't. Of course he did, because it's there very clearly in the scriptures. His name is found, but it's not his name. I'll illustrate what I mean. The Mari documents, which is the discovery of Mari, the capital city. Yes, I do apologize for the screen because it's a bit washed out, but you'll have to use your own imaginative glasses to see it clearly. The Mari documents come from the capital, which was the capital of the Amorites. Now, the Amorites appear a lot in your Old Testament, and they were a people who were contemporaneous with Abraham. And they were only a couple of 100 miles away from where he was in Ur of Chaldees. And when these documents were discovered, some 20,000 or so of them, Andrew Fleming, a professor of Old Testament, he has spent years examining them. And there are many, many links. The main link would be that all the social life that is discovered in these documents fits perfectly into the book of Genesis, and that is generally accepted now. The old idea that Genesis didn't fit the second millennium BC has long gone. Professor Kenneth Kitchen made the case that there is not a scrap of evidence that the two don't fit. They fit perfectly. And in fact, even the names of Noah, Abraham, Laban, Jacob, Gad, Dan, Levi, and many place names are all there in the Mari documents. Now, they are not the biblical people because they come in from a different area, but they are contemporaneous. They are showing that these names are names that are known at that time. If you go online, you can find, for even today, people saying, well, we know the Bible, Old Testament, is rubbish because it talks about Abraham owning camels, and we know that they didn't have domesticated camels as far back as around 2000 BC. Well, what you're looking at, actually, is the imprint of a cylinder scroll, a cylinder stamp seal, and it actually has 2 camels on it. Look very carefully, and I'll help to bring them up. I've triggered them out in gold a bit for you. Actually, it's only one because the seal's been rolled over. And it's a 2-humped camel, so it's a Bactrian camel, and it actually has 2 gods sitting on it. Now, this is dated some 1800 to 1400 BC, somewhere between there. So you're very close to the time of Abraham. And when you look at something like this, which is a petroglyph, a drawing on rocks, and this is in the Saudi Arabia, and again you're going back close to the time of Abraham. And if you look very carefully, I'm sorry, this is not very, and I don't even think you might just see, here is a chariot, and there are 2 horses tethered to the chariot, and here is a 1-humped camel. The good thing about camels is they're very easy to recognize. Even I can pretty much draw a camel that you would recognize. And so it's now pretty well generally accepted that of course there could be camels in the time of Abraham. And I think there's a lovely little sidekick here that they may not all be familiar with them, because the Hebrew word that is used of Rebecca coming down from the camel is that she jumped down from the camel. Now, you don't normally jump down from a camel. She probably hadn't learned how to make a camel kneel. You almost feel that she fell off the camel, but that is another aside. What I do love to show folk is this. This comes from the private collection of Donald Wiseman, actually, and he very kindly let me photograph it for him. These come from Ur of the Chaldees. When Sir Leonard was digging up around Ur of the Chaldees in the 1920s and 30s, this, remember, is the hometown of Abraham. He discovered that Abraham and Sarah could have lived in a 2-story house with some primitive plumbing, a kitchen, reception room, and a bedroom. And there were thousands and thousands of these clay tablets. Now you have here a letter. This is the letter with the message on it, and you have the envelope you put it in. This was put in when it was wet, so it's come in reverse in the back. I'm sorry. Let me just go back. I've got a long way on. And we have you put the top of the letter on top of it, seal it round, you put it in one of these little red letter boxes, and 3 weeks later it will be delivered. We have tens of thousands of these. Many of them have never yet been deciphered. So who knows, we may yet discover the name Abraham, our Abraham. There's no reason why we might not. There are marriage contracts, there are leasing property. This is actually the rent for a room in a temple, pagan temple. There are orders for merchandise being shipped across the whole of the Mesopotamian era, and even complaints of the delivery of the wrong produce. You see, Amazon's got nothing new at all. I give you this to show you how Abraham came from a highly civilized society, people who had good information. We know that they had a working knowledge of geometry. They knew the theorem of Pythagoras 1,500 years before the Greek philosopher. They could even do quadratic equations, which I haven't a clue about. So there we are. These people were a very highly intelligent people, but also very religious. And Abraham would have one time worshipped at the big ziggurat dedicated to the moon god before God called him out of that. Moving on, a question that people will often ask is, what is the evidence of Israel either in Egypt or in the desert, in the wilderness? Well, in Egypt, of course, they were in Goshen, and there's plenty of evidence of Semites, people who from the Semitic background, in Egypt. I'm not going to look into that on this presentation. But also, of course, they lived in Goshen, and Goshen was subject to the tidal floods of the River Nile, or the annual floods. And of course, mud brick buildings, generally speaking, don't last very long. In fact, there's very little archaeological evidence of anything. I think Kitchen says only a few wine dockets are available from that area. So there's no reason why we would have expected much there. That does not prove anything. Remember this phrase I'm going to give you because it's very important. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Have you got it? I may mention that again, but keep it in mind because it's very, you see, people say, we haven't found it, so it wasn't there. No, and you must correct them and say, no, what you really mean is we haven't found it, so we haven't yet found it. It doesn't mean it wasn't there. When they went into the wilderness, they went into a very large tract of land. And they were, of course, they were nomads, they were Bedouins. And they are known as archaeologically invisible. What do people in tents and clay pots and leather pots leave behind them? Besides, of course, we're not sure of the route they took, and there is 24,000 square miles of nothing in the Sinai Desert. And yet, believe it or not, we haven't yet dug it all up. So we don't know. But the evidence of absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Who were the Hittites? Now, you should know the Hittites. Abraham bought a field to bury Sarah from the Hittites. David committed adultery with the wife of Uriah, who was a Hittite officer, military officer. Who were they? Now, ignore when you see any programs on Hittites when they show you these people, because they have been discovered. They had Hattusis, their capital, in Turkey in 1906. And they will dismiss any connection by saying, of course, these were not the Hittites of the Bible. That's one of these throwaway statements that's just made. And there's absolutely no reason, we know of no other people than the Hittites apart from the Hittites. And there are good reasons why a military officer of the Hittites might have been one of David's commanders. We know about these people partly because their capital has been discovered, but also because we know that they fought a very famous battle with Ramesses II, the pharaoh of Egypt, and he's one of the best known pharaohs that we have. In 1274, they fought a battle between the two. We know exactly how many went into battle because they give us the details. And they fought themselves to a standstill. And the next day, they'd both run out of puff. And so eventually, they came to what is thought to be one of the world's first peace treaties. Of course, it wasn't, because you have peace treaties between Abraham and Abimelech in the Old Testament, but they ignore that. But one of the world's first peace treaties. And when Ramesses II went back to Egypt, he built a huge temple at Abu Simnel. Each one of these, if you can make them out, each one of these figures, which of course is him, there's 4 of them, they are 60 feet high, so it gives you some idea. And this, when you go inside, the walls are plastered with the battle against the Hittites. So there is no question at all about the Hittites. But I have to tell you, there was a time when, because the only knowledge of the Hittites was in the Old Testament, is that they didn't exist, because these were an unknown people. No one today questions the Hittites. They are well known. Now, this is very important. Was David a legendary figure? In case you're not aware of it, I need to tell you that many critics believe that the whole of your Old Testament, up to the time of and including Saul and David and Solomon, and perhaps not beyond there, because then they are plugged into history. Many of the early kings of Israel and Judah are referred to by pagan documents as well as the Old Testament. But the bit that is not referred to, all the Old Testament was actually made up, it's all legendary, to give the Israelites a history made up by Jewish scribes somewhere around the 5th or 6th century when they were in the Persian exile. And these people, now taken away from their land, in the land of exile, they want a history. And so they made up all these wonderful legends. Now, of course, immediately, regardless of your view of the authority of the Old Testament, you must scratch your head and say, is it likely that some of the accounts would be there? Would you make up the story of David, who is your great hero, and some of the things David did? Not just his adultery with Bathsheba, but I could give you other things that you'll find in the Old Testament that don't speak well of King David. But was there a David? Well, because we hadn't got a David, they could get away with that until, of course, the Tel Dan inscription, discovered at Tel Dan in northern Israel. And the Tel Dan inscription is an inscription from Hazael. He's also mentioned in the Old Testament. And Hazael was the king of Syria, not Assyria, Syria. And he refers to the fact that he killed the king of Israel and the king of the house of David. There is no question about that phrase now. And the significant thing is, no one questions that this inscription you're looking at here, and sorry, I'm in the way for some of you, but this is the house of David here, Beth David, and that is dated around, in round terms, 800 BC, 7960 to be exact, but 800 will do. And that's around 300 years before the legends of David were made up by these scribes in the 6th century. So no one really questions the existence of David. Of course, they question the kind of king he was revealed in the Old Testament, but at least David is on the map by even the critic. There is, I keep finding myself having to add, there is one critic who tries to tell us that Bet David is really another name for Israel's God, but no one really accepts that. When you're scratching around as low as that, you're in big trouble. It's much better to accept there was a David. and then you can discuss what kind of David he was. But in addition, at Khirbet Qaifa, there's been a lot of, and it's ongoing, archaeological work done. And this is a beautiful fortified settlement. And it is conclusively agreed that it is an Israelite outpost, and it comes from the time of David. It's a strong fortified settlement because actually it has 2 gates. I've highlighted one of them there for you so that you can see it, and they are very heavily fortified gates. Now, the gate was always the weak point in any city. The gates in this case face towards Jerusalem. They have not found many pig bones in the debris, and also some of the oldest Hebrew writing has been discovered at Khirbet Qaifa, and they're not yet quite sure what that writing says, because it is very old and there's not much of it. But this is pretty conclusively, I don't think there's hardly anybody who... And there's another city, similarly, that's being excavated at the present time. So David is back on the map, as the Hittites are back on the map. What about this guy here, Sargon? You see, the problem is there was a king mentioned in the Bible in just one verse. Isaiah 22 verse 1 is Sargon. And, chapter 20 verse 1, not 22. And Sargon appeared nowhere else in history but in that one verse in the Bible. So guess what? He didn't exist either. That is until in 1843, Paul-Émile Botta, a French archaeologist, discovered Sargon's fortress. Now, Sargon is one of the best-known kings of the ancient world. We have a huge amount of his writings. We discovered his palace. We know so much about him. And this king who never existed is facing what we think is his son Sennacherib. More on Sennacherib in just a moment. But also this king who never existed actually was able to build 2 huge 10-ton, 15 feet high, huge human-headed winged bulls to guard his palace, which is really not bad for a king who never existed. But more significantly for us in a way is this, that this is the king who destroyed finally in the year 722 BC northern Israel. Actually, he finished off what his brother had started before he died, but never mind, he took the glory for it. He is the one who did what all the ancient kings did except one, and we'll come to him shortly. They took the cream of the population out. That's how years later Daniel and Ezekiel and their friends found themselves in Babylon, but that's a few centuries down the line. They took the cream of the population out and they brought people back in from other nations. The whole idea was to dilute the possibility of any nationalistic uprising within your borders of defeated territory. And that's exactly what he did. And so 2 Kings 17 says the king of Assyria brought people from all of these places to Samaria, and they settled with the Israelites. But what they also did was, of course, to bring their gods with them. And over the years, the people in the northern territory, based on Samaria in Israel, they mixed in some dreadful potpourri, they mixed together their gods with the true worship of Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. And that's why the people in the south never got on with the people in the north. So whenever you come to that verse in John 4:9, the Jews do not associate with Samaritans, I want you always to think Sargon. It was all his fault back in the year 722. That's where it started. But let's have another look at Sennacherib, because there's a lot of Sennacherib in the Bible, and actually there's a lot of the Bible in Sennacherib as well. Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, in the time of Hezekiah, one of Judah's greatest kings, a true spiritual revival broke out in the time of Hezekiah. Now, this coming up on the screen is not Hezekiah, this is Sennacherib. Sennacherib says, "As to Hezekiah the Jew, I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities, walled forts, and to the countless small villages in their vicinity." He took his huge Assyrian army, trundled it through the land, and over the period of a few years, he destroyed much of the southern part of the land, until, of course, he then eventually came to the city of Jerusalem. But before then, he laid siege to the second most important city, and that was the city of Lachish. And when he went back home to Nineveh, his capital, he had a wonderful portrayal of the Battle of Lachish, not Jerusalem, notice, of Lachish. That was his victory celebration. In the British Museum, it covers some 60 feet, which is, well, it's difficult on a round building to tell you what 60 feet is, but it would be from the door to the posts over there, all the way and a little bit round the end here. And you have the lineup of the battle at the beginning. Interesting, we know exactly what time of the year it was because there are grapes in the top corner. And you go to Lachish today, as I've done, and there are vineyards still around Lachish today, all these centuries later. This is the year 701 BC. And the whole army is lined up until you come eventually to the siege itself of Lachish. You have the battering ram coming up here, and then down in the bottom corner here, you can't see it very well, you have the early form of crucifixion. The Assyrians would put a stake through a man's groin or his stomach and leave him to die. The Persians and then the Romans perfected the art of killing a man over the longest period of time in the most painful possible way. If you were to go to Lachish today, you won't see the city as it was. That is an artist's impression. But you can still see the siege ramp running up the side of the hill. And it's quite impressive to see that. And they are doing major, they weren't doing it when I was there, but they're doing major archaeological work at Lachish today. A lot of understanding is coming. Now, that is significant because it was the second largest and most important city, and now it's gone to the Assyrians. I just want to give a little interlude here because it's intriguing. Can you see the stone slingers? No, you can't. The sun's right on them. Let me bring them down. At their feet are a little pile of stones, all right? These were the artillery of the ancient world. In fact, every Rome, even in the time of Rome, every Roman legionary had to be able to use a sling. Those stones, here are some of them, the actual stones used, found at Lachish after that battle in 701. And we know now that in the arm of a strong man, these stones, which are the size of a billiard ball, can reach a velocity of 60 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour, and travel a quarter of a mile. That just reminds you of how, in fact, powerful these can be. The tribe of Benjamin had 700 men who could sling a stone at a hare. That's this one, not a bunny rabbit, and not miss. And in fact, there was a tribe, some men could sling with either the right hand or the left. This was a lethal weapon. Remember who used it? He didn't need 5 stones. David had already killed a bear and a lion in the same manner. And that giant was a dead man before he got out of his tent in the morning. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Hezekiah has got probably 3 or 4 years to prepare for the coming siege of Jerusalem. And he needed, as every city needed to do, to ensure a water supply for themselves and deny it to the enemy outside. And the Bible says that he channeled the water down to the west side of the city, the tunnel through which he brought water into the city. What he did was to channel it with his engineers from the Kidron Valley into the city. And it actually went down into the pool of Siloam, which was only fully uncovered in the year 2004. There's a lovely story behind that, but I can't stop and tell you that now. This is an amazing tunnel. Anybody actually walked through Hezekiah's tunnel? Good. You'll know, I don't know where the water was when you were there. Sometimes it can be up to the waist, but mostly it's only over your ankles. But you can walk the entire journey. It's 599 meters, winding a bit. They started at both ends, 49 meters down. All they would have had was a little oil lamp and a pick. And today, engineers have no idea how they knew how they could meet in the middle. We know they met in the middle because they left a plaque on the wall. It's now in the Istanbul Museum, but they left a plaque on the wall explaining how the two engineers met together in the middle. And this was Hezekiah's tunnel. It's known as Hezekiah's tunnel, a marvelous feat of engineering straight out of the Bible. This is the Pool of Siloam as it's known today, and this is the one that would have been there in the time of Jesus. If you remind me in Q&A, if you want to know, I'll tell you more. Now, the Isaiah promised that he in no way would the Sennacherib even bring fire and arrow into the city. So there never was a siege of Jerusalem. You know the account in the Bible? During that night, his army was destroyed by an unseen hand. Herodotus, the Greek historian, actually confirms that, but he says that he has a different version of it, and the mice chewed all the bowstrings or something like that. But at least he acknowledges, it's acknowledged that the army had to go back home, and it was a defeat. That is why, when he went back home, you see, in the ancient world, you never lost a battle. That's why Ramesses II, when he actually drew 0-0 to the Hittites, he went back home and built a huge temple to celebrate his victory. And the Lachish victory room at Nineveh was his celebration of victory. What he didn't tell you was what he does tell you on this Taylor prism. Because on the Taylor prism, Sennacherib tells us about many of his exploits and his victories. And he tells us here how he got tribute from Hezekiah. But all he can say is that he shut up Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. The problem is, he couldn't open the gate and get the bird out of the cage. Now, another king who never existed. Now, incidentally, no one had doubted Sennacherib. He was well known in history, so he's not one of those who was doubted. But it's interesting that he's mentioned in the Bible, and he mentions the Bible king as well. Belshazzar. Now, there's a double problem here, because not only was Belshazzar never mentioned anywhere but in the Bible, but we knew very well who the king in Babylon was when the Persians broke in. And his name was Nabonidus. In fact, here he is worshipping three of his gods. So how could Belshazzar be the king in Babylon when the Persians broke in and got killed that very night, when in fact Nabonidus was the king of Babylon? And anyway, there isn't a Belshazzar. He's only there in the Bible, so you can see the Bible got it wrong. Well, that was until this was discovered. It's a little clay cylinder, a little barrel actually, about so long, and there were 4 of them, and they were at the base of they were like time capsules at the base of a temple to the moon god that Nabonidus had rebuilt, and he wanted you all to know that. And on it, there is a prayer for himself, of course, and for Belshazzar, my firstborn, the offspring of my heart. So there was a Belshazzar. We've got that far. But what was he doing being king in Babylon? Well, we now know that actually Nabonidus was away fighting and had been for many years in Arabia fighting battles. And he had put Belshazzar, the crown prince, on the throne. See, he was acting king in Babylon. And he was having a whoopee time in the absence of his dad away there fighting battles. And he's the one who got killed when the Babylonians broke in. When the Persians broke in. And the Persian records tell us that they caught up with the king and captured him later. That would be Nabonidus. So let's just see how far we've got. Evidence for people and events who never existed as some thought. The global flood, there's plenty of evidence for that. Abraham, there's more and more evidence for that. The Hittites, David, Sargon of Assyria, and Belshazzar of Babylon. You might be interested in the fact that there are many, many dozens of, well, thousands altogether, of seal impressions. Now, the ID card, or the visa, if you like, of the ancient world was either a flat seal that you stamped on clay, and that would be your ideal ID card, or a cylinder seal, a seal of a little tube of calcite or stone, about as thick as, a bit thicker than your finger, and you would have your details written around it, and that was rolled over soft clay. Now, the flat kind of seals, many of these are being found constantly. Here's one, Ahaz, king of Judah. And here's another one, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. Now, this is what is actually written on them. No one questions this. These are biblical kings just literally coming out of the ground. But what is intriguing is we actually have a seal of Berechiah, the son of Neriah the scribe. This is Jeremiah's secretary who wrote his prophecies down. He's often referred to, Baruch, he comes under the name, shorthand version of it, in the book of Jeremiah. We have a couple of these. One even has a thumbprint on it, so we may have the thumbprint of Jeremiah's secretary. But don't quote me on that. We can't, until we actually meet with Jeremiah's secretary, we'll never know whose thumbprint it was. There are many, many more of these that are very intriguing, and they're coming out of the ground all the time, confirming the reality of all of these people. Before I close, I want to give a couple of quick illustrations of instructions never given. You remember what I said earlier, that the ancient kings always took people out of the land and fed other people back in to dilute the population. The one exception to that was Cyrus, king of Persia. When he broke in 539 and conquered Babylon, he had a change of mind. And the Bible records, this is what Cyrus, the king of Persia, says. You can go back to Jerusalem, you can rebuild your city, you can take your gods with you. They said, oh, but we don't have any gods. But tell you what we would like. We'd like some of the things that Nebuchadnezzar stole from the temple in Jerusalem. Oh, you can take those back with you, yes. And actually the exchequer, there's no recession here, we haven't had a pandemic, so actually we'll contribute some of the cost of rebuilding for you. And the Jews, you remember, in Ezra and Nehemiah went back. And critics for years said, that's ridiculous. That's not what ancient kings did. Until another lump of clay came on the market. The Cyrus cylinder is considered so important that a replica is in the United Nations headquarters, and it's been translated into all 27 official languages of the UN. It is still an icon of Iran, and it went on a tour a few years ago, and kindly Iran gave it back to the British Museum. Why? It's considered to be the earliest Magna Carta. I think that's a bit OTT, but if they want to say that, that's fine with me. And all he does is he doesn't mention the Jews on the Cyrus cylinder, but he mentions a lot of other nations. He says, you can go home, build your cities, build your temples, and take your gods back with you. Why did he do that? Well, they were going to be in love with him, weren't they? And they would pray to their gods, to him, for him, and therefore he would be in a good position. Now that is another very simple illustration of how something dismissed by the critics is not dismissed by anyone today. You can recognize him, can you? Yep, okay, that's the guy, Caesar Augustus. He gave, I think I'm not going to, for the sake of time, because I'm going to come back to this one in a subsequent one, but I want to introduce you to somebody that I think is very important, and if you're doing any Old Testament study, you really ought to know him. Now, you folk here should know this guy, Robert Dick Wilson. If ever there's a Presbyterian to be proud of, you can be proud of Robert Dick Wilson. He taught at Princeton and was one of the founders of Westminster Theological Seminary. Brilliant Old Testament scholar. You can't do Old Testament studies without understanding Dick Wilson. And the reason why he's not mentioned so often in critical books is simply because he was so good and he answered all the critics. He was a giant over even people like Wellhausen and Davidson, if you know those names. Now, he was professor of Semitic philology, never mind what that is, it sounds very impressive, at Princeton Theological Seminary, and as I say, a founder member of the Westminster Seminary. Now, he learned a few languages in the first 15 years of his study. So just take a look down those and feel suitably humiliated by them. He learned, in fact, 26 languages and dialects in order to be able to read every piece of literature that had any bearing on the Old Testament. He divided his life into 15 years, 3 lots of 15 years, and God gave him all 15. 1 year learning one group learning the language, the second 15 years reading everything, and the third 15 years preaching and teaching and lecturing and writing. And in the conclusion of it all, this is his conclusion. I try to give my students such an intelligent faith in the Old Testament scriptures that they will never doubt them as long as they live. No man knows enough to assail the truthfulness of the Old Testament. He has a way of writing. One of the first books I ever read, of course, actually was some of his material, and it's absolutely brilliant. But it is so helpful because he could answer, and he actually mocks some of the great scholars of his day that were well-known critics, and said the problem is they couldn't read the right languages. They couldn't read what was available for them. So I want to bring to a conclusion reminding you that the entire history of the Old Testament is a preparation for the presence of Jesus the Messiah in Israel 2,000 years ago. His birth, his life, his death, and his resurrection. You see, many believe that the Bible cannot be trusted because it's not history in the true sense. It's a mixture of error and fables. There are 2 reasons for this. One is they haven't read it, and the other is they simply accept what they're told without ever studying it. Remember, every word of God proves true. We must never add to his words or take from them, lest he rebuke us and we be found a liar. I believe that Donald Wiseman was correct when he said archaeology, correctly understood, always confirms the accuracy of the Bible. And if all of that we have seen is true, the greatest historical record of all time is the record of the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if you go to the garden tomb today, which is not the tomb that Jesus was buried in, it would not be right to say that, but as you turn round and come out, there's a notice on the door that says, "He is not here, for he is risen." The resurrection of Jesus Christ is a historical fact, and it demonstrates who he is and what he came to do. Now I'm going to leave it there. While the chairman's coming up, I could just mention the 2 books that are available, if I may. And we've got a few minutes we can have for questions. The first is Evidence for the Bible. Some of you will know that my colleague Clive Anderson and myself had done a through the British Museum with the Bible. It's a tour of the British Museum with the many, many Bible-related items. We're now in our 6th edition of that, and that together with this one on the screen, Evidence for the Bible, is sold in the British Museum at all their points of outlet. And is still there, even now they're just back up and running after lockdown. And I want to, there are a number of copies out there, but one is open. Browse through it, have a look at it. I do recommend it to you because there's a great deal in there. It's easy to read. I don't know about you, but I like books where you can read everything on one page. You do not have to turn over a page to finish an article. They're all on one page. Apart from at the back, where we have a lot of bigger articles dealing with the huge number of people that came out of Egypt. How do we handle that? Who might be the true Pharaoh in the time of Moses? What about this Quirinius problem and the census? All those kind of things. There's a number of those longer articles in the back. It's fully researched, and every statement and comment we make is referenced, so you can go and find the references. We're not making things up. If there's a question about something, we'll say this is not yet proven. So I do recommend that to you. And incidentally, I've just this last week signed off a twin volume of this book that I've done with Clive Anderson and Chris Sinkinson from Moorlands College, which is really called Background to the Bible, and it's really a twin. There's so many things, we're just adding more to the book you've got here. And the other book is Nothing But the Truth. Now, one of the first books I ever wrote was under this title, gone through many different editions. We then brought it out into 6 small volumes, but we brought it back now into Nothing But the Truth. Now, there is a special deal on for these. They're all either half price or less than half price. The first one is for £12, the second is for 10, but right here today, if you buy both of them together, you can get the 2 of them for £20, and we can't do better than that. With that, I think I'll hand it back to the chairman, and you'll know how much time we've got.
Brian, thank you so much. Well, I'm going to hold on to that phrase from the wonderful Presbyterian professor, Dick Wilson, intelligent faith, because that seems to sum up what you said to us this morning, Brian. Our faith is not credulity. We always give the primacy to God's revelation, but it will never collide with reason correctly applied. And I've been thrilled and I've been inspired, and I know that you have. There's been a wonderful atmosphere in the room this morning. Now, we have a few minutes for questions, so I throw the questions over to the floor, and if there's anything that's intrigued you and you'd like to know more, this is your opportunity. Brad is going to take a microphone, so if you indicate that you've got a question, we'll get the microphone to you, and then people who are watching online can also contribute. And Benjamin, if there's anybody online with a question, you'll bring that as well to our knowledge.
That's all right. There's always a pause. Don't be afraid. If it won't be a foolish question, I can assure you.
All right. So we have a question from Nikos.
Thank you, Brian, for your talk this morning. Just one question around kind of statistics on the archaeological finds versus what we see archaeologically taught in the Bible. Would we say that, say, 50% of the evidence in the Bible has been archaeologically proved, or by other means or sources, or what's kind of the split here? Are we saying 80% or 20%?
It's not a question I've ever been asked before, and I don't think anybody would be able to answer it, because you see, and there's a good thing behind that question, because the Bible is so packed with historical reality. We're going to be looking at this in the next session, when we simply look at no one other than Luke and his writing in the Gospel and Acts. And he is at pains to put history after history, quite unnecessary. Why does he do it? Because he wants us to know this is rooted in history. And because there's so much of it, I don't think anybody will know the answer. And anyway, if we had the answer today, it would be wrong tomorrow. Because people don't always realize that archaeology is a moving thing. It's going on all the time. And biblical archaeology I'm talking about. And it's very thrilling, because some of you may subscribe to the Biblical Archaeological Review, and I thoroughly recommend that, because it is reliable. It's not thoroughly evangelical, but that's actually the good thing. I mean, some of the articles are quite ridiculous from critics, but if there's whatever is happening at the sharp end of archaeology and the Bible, they'll be there, and they'll give you a dispassionate comment on it. They'll indicate that there are two sides of this argument. Somebody once said, actually, that certainty in archaeology lasts about 20 years, and that's true. So I don't think there is an answer, because it's happening all the time. Let me take the pool of Siloam, can I, for a moment? Because if you've got another question, put your hand up, and I'll stop, and I'll take questions first then.
Thank you so much, Brian. This is just a question from online. Victor's asking, you mentioned the traditions about Noah's Ark and that it comes in cultures all over the world. And Victor's just asking, is there also archaeological proof for Noah's Ark?
Is there archaeological proof of Noah's Ark? Very good question, because of course over the years there have been lots of attempts to find Noah's Ark. Films have been made. People have gone on expeditions to find it. One of the most recent was a Jordanian airline pilot who actually saw what he thought was the outline of an ark, and it was named, that area has been named after him. All I can say is the answer is no. Nothing that is confirmed. And it leads me to say, please do be careful of fake news when it comes to archaeology. Some people are so eager to get into the spotlight that they'll say something and then it disappears. And in fact, we've got a section coming in the new book I mentioned, and it is actually going to be called Fake News, because sometimes even Harvard professors, is a classic case of that, have been beguiled by a deliberate fraud. So things have to settle down. So I would say, no, we haven't found it. And it's quite unlikely we would. Remember, you are going back many millennia, and the boat was made out of wood. And wood doesn't last too long. And it would have been on top of much of the sediment of the flood, not underneath it. So it should be there if it was there. So I think it's wise to say no. If I can add to that, because some people may be thinking, but what about the stories of chariot wheels found under the Red Sea? And the answer is no, forget that as well, because there's one problem. You can look at these grainy photographs and they may look like chariot wheels, and they may be chariot wheels. But since, understandably, the authorities will not allow you to bring any coral up from the bottom of the sea, they cannot be subject to forensic examination. And therefore, we've no idea what's beneath all this coral. So we don't need that. There is so much that everything I've told you today and will tell you today, and if there's a query, I'll put a query beside it, is accepted. All these people, Sargon, David, the Hittites, all Belshazzar, they're all accepted. Nobody questions them. So we don't need to look for that. Sorry, long answer, short question, but the answer is really no.
It's very helpful. It's very helpful. Are there any other questions? We don't need all the questions to come now. Some of you will want to wait till you've heard a little bit more.
Well, if I could just ask one question. Something that I found, Brian, in my very little research done in Egyptology, is that the prevalent Egyptologists are simply unwilling to look at the new evidence that actually supports the biblical history.
Yes.
Would you be able to explain to us, perhaps briefly, why that is?
Yes, the question is that there are, in Egyptian dynasties, Egyptian dating, there are many. There's a broad orthodox position of the dating of Egyptian history, but then there are people like David Rohl and John Bimson and so on who come out with very different accounts, and there's an unwillingness on the part of the main line to consider. I wouldn't profess to be in any way expert at unraveling the complexities of Egyptian history. And where I would differ personally, and many of you would, I guess, as well, is in the dating of the Exodus, either late date or an early date, and I believe a 15th century date in the time of Moses is right and biblically justifiable, but they believe that there's archaeological evidence against that. We needn't go into that at the moment. But I think the danger is, on this subject and many others, the main orthodox line is fixed, and there is a reluctance to take seriously other people's views. Now, those other people's views may be wrong, and some of them have to be. They can't all be right because they're different. It doesn't actually affect, in any material way, anything we say about the Bible. Because even those who believe in a 13th century date for the Exodus in the time of Ramesses II, for example, would still, but if they're evangelical and conservative Christians, they will still say, but we believe there was this miraculous exodus and crossing of the Red Sea and so on. So it's not really a question of if, but when. So although we can almost, and some will cane me for saying it, almost leave the Egyptologists to argue among themselves on their dynastic datings. Manetho, the great scholar who gave in the 3rd century or 4th century BC the datings that are mainly accepted today, he did a lot of fine work, and a lot of his dating, not all, is accepted today. But that's another story in itself. So yes, there's always a danger, and we see it in a lot of areas, not least in creation, evolution, that people's position is fixed and they cannot change.